The photograph sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Daphne Osei touched it. It wasn't a bad photo. The man in it looked like someone who fixed things, pipes maybe, or engines. He was standing in front of a pickup truck with a little boy on his shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun. The boy was laughing. The man was not. Daphne picked it up on a Thursday morning, coffee in hand, and studied it the way she studied quarterly reports, methodically, looking for what wasn't obvious. Her father had placed it there without ceremony. "This is Edmund Calloway. He's a good man. You should meet him." That was it. No preamble, no explanation for why the CEO of Callaway Marsh Holdings, a woman who had restructured 3 companies before her 42nd birthday, was being handed a photograph of a stranger like it was a classified ad. She set the photo face down and went to work. Daphne Osei had built her reputation on one skill. She could walk into a room and know, within minutes, exactly what was being hidden from her. Board members, investors, auditors who thought they were clever. She had a nose for performance, the kind people put on when they knew they were being watched. Her father, Kweku, was not a sentimental man. He had come from Accra to Toronto at 23 with $40 and a letter of introduction to a man who didn't remember writing it. He had built his import business from a storage locker in Scarborough. He didn't give his daughter photographs of strangers without a reason, so Daphne did what she always did when something didn't add up. She went looking. Edmund Calloway wasn't hard to find, but he was surprisingly hard to read. Public records showed a house in Sudbury, bought outright 11 years ago, a contracting license, general construction, a son named Marcus, 8 years old, a wife, Claire, who had died of a brain aneurysm 4 years prior. That part landed differently than the rest. She read it twice. No social media, no LinkedIn. A business page for Callaway Custom Builds with 17 reviews, all of them from people who sounded like they actually knew him. "Edmund fixed our foundation when 3 other guys told us to move. He stayed until 9 on a Friday. Honest. Doesn't pad the bill. Rare." She closed the laptop. Then she opened it again and booked a room at a bed and breakfast in Sudbury for 2 weeks, under her mother's maiden name, Daphne Mensa, a freelance bookkeeper in town for a contract job. She told herself it wasn't sufficient. It was due diligence. She had done it for companies. She could do it for this. The house across from the B&B was not Edmund's. His was 3 streets over. But the town was small enough that by the second morning, she had already seen his truck twice, once dropping Marcus at a school that looked too cheerful for February, and once parked outside a hardware store where Edmund stood in the parking lot for 4 full minutes before going in, like he was settling something with himself. She noticed that. The B&B was run by a woman named Harriet, who made eggs the way Daphne's grandmother used to, in a cast-iron pan with too much butter, and who offered opinions on the town the way other people offered salt, freely and without being asked. "That's the Callaway boy," Harriet said the first morning, nodding toward the window as the blue truck passed. "Edmund, you'll probably run into him. Town's not big enough to avoid anyone for long." Daphne made a sound that was not a question. "His wife passed a few years back, terrible thing. He kept the business going, kept Marcus in hockey, kept everything going." Harriet refilled Daphne's coffee without asking. "Some men fall apart. He didn't. I don't know if that's strength or stubbornness. Maybe both." Daphne looked at her cup. "He's a bit guarded," Harriet added. "Can't blame him." She met him on the 4th day at the grocery store because of a jar of pasta sauce on a high shelf. She wasn't performing helplessness. She was genuinely too short. The jar was genuinely too high. Edmund Calloway appeared at her left shoulder like a fact she hadn't accounted for and said, "Which one?" without any fanfare, and when she pointed, he handed it down and walked away before she could thank him properly. That was it. That was the whole encounter. She stood in the cereal aisle for a long moment afterward. He had looked nothing like a man who needed anything. She ran into him again 2 days later at the rink. not because she followed him. Marcus had hockey practice, and Harriet had mentioned the rink had the best coffee in town, which turned out to be accurate only if your other options were the gas station or nothing. The arena was cold and echoey and smelled of rubber mats and old Zamboni fumes. Daphne sat in the third row of the bleachers with her hands wrapped around a paper cup and watched a group of 8-year-olds chase a puck with the seriousness of geopolitical negotiators. Edmund sat 2 rows down and 1 section over, and he did not check his phone once. He watched Marcus the entire time. When Marcus fell, hard, skidding into the boards, Edmund was already half standing before the kid scrambled back up and kept going. Edmund sat back down. He let out a breath she could see from where she was sitting. A man beside her leaned over. "You visiting?" "Working, actually," she said. "Bookkeeping contract, cold time of year for Sudbury. I didn't pick the season." He laughed. "That's Edmund down there. Good guy. Does a lot of work around town. Did my deck last summer?" He paused. "Widower. Raises that boy on his own." "I heard," Daphne said, and immediately wasn't sure why she admitted that. The man gave her a look that was not unfriendly. After practice, she was pulling on her coat when Marcus Calloway ran past in his skates, blades clicking on the rubber mat, and crashed directly into her coffee cup, which was thankfully empty. He looked up at her with enormous eyes and said, "Sorry, I'm really sorry. Did I get you?" "You didn't get me. My dad says I need to look where I'm going more. Your dad is probably right." Edmund appeared at the boy's shoulder and looked at Daphne with an expression that was very careful and very neutral and said, "Sorry about that." He already apologized. Twice. Something shifted in Edmund's expression, very slightly. "He's thorough, so I noticed." Marcus tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad. Skates." Edmund nodded and guided the boy toward the bench without looking back at her, but something had been exchanged in that 30-second conversation that Daphne couldn't quite name. And she thought about it on the drive back to Harriet's, and she thought about it at dinner, and she thought about it later, at her laptop, with her father's photograph face up on the desk for the first time since she'd arrived. She didn't plan to run into him again. But Sudbury in February doesn't offer many alternatives. They crossed paths at the library, he returning a stack of picture books, her using the Wi-Fi, and at the diner on Cedar Street, where she ate alone, and he ate alone at separate tables until Harriet, who materialized from nowhere, sat down across from Daphne and waved Edmund over with the authority of a woman who considered loneliness a preventable condition. "Edmund, this is Daphne. She's a bookkeeper. She's been staying with me. She doesn't know anyone in town. Sit down." Edmund looked at Daphne. Daphne looked at Edmund. "You were at the rink," he said. "Marcus knocked into my coffee cup," he told me. He felt bad about it. A pause. "He actually told me twice." Like I said, thorough. Edmund sat down. What surprised her most was how little he talked about himself. Not in a withholding way. More like he had already sorted out which things were worth saying and which weren't, and he wasn't going to fill silence with words just to fill it. She found herself doing most of the talking, which didn't happen to her in meetings, ever. And she was halfway through explaining her position on municipal infrastructure contracts before she realized she'd invented a client in Sudbury and could not now remember what she'd said his name was. "You enjoy it?" Edmund asked. "The work? I'm good at it. That's not the same thing." She looked at him. "Doesn't have to be," he said. "Just noticing." Marcus, at a kid's table in the corner with a coloring sheet the diner provided, called out, "Dad, what's the capital of Saskatchewan? Regina. Is that a real word?" "It's a real city." Marcus considered this with the gravity of a jurist. "Okay." Daphne watched Edmund watch his son, and she thought about the photograph on her counter in Toronto, the man not smiling. And then she looked at this man across from her, who also wasn't smiling exactly, but who was something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. Present. He was completely, uncomplicatedly present. She had not met many people like that. The second week, she stopped pretending she was there for work. Not out loud, she didn't confess anything. But she started going to the rink because she wanted to, and she started sitting closer. And she stopped checking her email during practice, and one afternoon she helped Marcus untangle a lace that had knotted itself into something that resembled a topological problem. And he said, "You're good at this," very seriously. And she said, "I'm good at most things." And he said, "My dad says that too about himself, but he says it in a different voice." And she laughed out loud, which surprised both of them. Edmund was watching from behind her and said nothing, but she turned and caught the edge of an expression that he tucked away before it fully formed. That evening, Harriet poured 2 glasses of wine at the kitchen table and slid one across to Daphne without comment and said, "After a while, you're not a bookkeeper." Daphne looked at her wine. "I'm not asking what you are," Harriet said. "Just noting. I work in finance." Harriet drank. "Edmund's a careful man. He's been careful for 4 years, for good reason." "I know. Do you?" The question sat there. Daphne didn't try to answer it, because the honest answer was that she wasn't sure. On Thursday of the second week, Marcus showed her a drawing. It was not a good drawing in any technical sense. It was a house. Their house, she understood, from the truck drawn in front of it, and 2 stick figures of varying heights. And then a third figure that was clearly female, with a triangle skirt and a ponytail that Marcus had given approximately 12 lines of effort to. "That's you," he said. She was very still. "I put you by the house because you come by now," he explained, with the patience of someone explaining something to an adult who was being slow. "So you should be in the picture." She took the drawing carefully and looked at it for a long moment. The stick figure version of herself stood in front of a house she had never been inside, next to a man who didn't know who she was. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, and her voice did a thing she didn't permit it to do in meetings. She kept the drawing. She folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. It was Edmund who found out, and he didn't find out from her. He ran into Patrick and Lovu, her father's old business partner, a man who had been at her parents' anniversary dinner 3 years running and had a framed photo of Kweku on his office wall at a supply house in Sudbury, of all places. Patrick had recognized the name Calloway from something Kweku had mentioned. He had mentioned Daphne. Edmund didn't call her. He just stopped coming to the diner. 2 days passed. She noticed Marcus wasn't at hockey practice on Saturday. She went to his house. The truck was in the driveway. She knocked. He opened the door and looked at her with an expression that had closed down completely, like a room where all the windows had been shuttered. "You knew," he said, "before you came here. Yes, your father. Yes." He didn't raise his voice. That was almost worse. He was very, very quiet. "I've had people come through this town and make all kinds of assumptions about what I need and what Marcus needs. I don't usually let them get this far." Edmund. How much of it was real? He asked it like it was a practical question, like he was assessing something that had been mislabeled. She didn't look away. "All of it." "That's a convenient answer. I know." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door slightly, not opening it, not closing it, just holding the in-between. "You should have told me. I know that too." From somewhere behind him, Marcus's voice called out, "Dad, is that Daphne?" Edmund didn't turn. His jaw moved. "Yeah," he said finally. "It is." There was the sound of small socked feet on hardwood, and then Marcus appeared at Edmund's elbow, looking at her with complete uncomplicated pleasure and said, "I thought you left already. Dad said your contract finished." Daphne looked at Edmund. "Not yet," she said. Edmund held the door open. She didn't come inside that night. They stood on the porch for 40 minutes in the cold, and she told him the actual version. Not the worst version, not the sanitized version, the actual one. Her father's logic, her own logic, the photograph on her kitchen counter, the moment in the grocery store. "I do due diligence," she said. "It's the only mode I have, on people, on everything." She paused. It doesn't usually feel like this. He was quiet for a moment. Like what? Like I should have just introduced myself in the grocery store. That first day, why didn't you? She thought about it honestly. Because I didn't trust the setup. My father doesn't explain things. He puts photographs on counters and expects you to figure it out. I wanted to figure it out first. Edmund looked out at the street. The street lights had come on. A neighbor's cat was sitting on a fence post with great dignity. Claire used to say I was the same way, he said. I need to understand something before I can. Get into it. It was the first time he'd said her name in Daphne's presence. It landed gently, the way first times do. I'm not asking you to trust me yet, Daphne said. I'm asking you to let me start from the right place. He considered this with the same settling expression she'd noticed outside the hardware store on her second day in town, deciding something. Marcus likes you, he said. I know, he put me in his drawing. For the first time, Edmund's face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It moved fully without being managed. He almost smiled. He showed you that. He put 12 lines of effort into my ponytail. This time he did smile. Brief, real, gone quickly. But there. It's cold, he said. You want coffee? She did. February became March. The snow on the cedars went from deep to patchy to gone. Daphne rescheduled her return to Toronto twice, then quietly reorganized 2 weeks of meetings around a standing Friday afternoon that had no formal name. She met with her Sudbury clients on Mondays and Tuesdays. Real ones by then, because she'd been referred twice by people who knew someone who'd heard she was in town and was very good. She ate dinner at Harriet's 3 nights a week and at Edmund's kitchen table the other 4, where Marcus taught her the rules of hockey with great authority. And Edmund cooked things that were not complicated but were very good, the way all his work seemed to be. The trust came in layers, that was the only word for it. Not in any single conversation or gesture, but in the accumulation of ordinary things. The coffee order he started remembering. The afternoon, she brought Marcus a library book about Saskatchewan, and his face went entirely serious before breaking into the biggest grin she'd seen from him. The evening Edmund told her about the week Claire died, and she sat beside him at the kitchen table and said nothing at all because nothing was the right thing and she knew it. He noticed that too. You're good at knowing when not to talk, he told her once. Most people find that unsettling. Most people haven't run 3 companies. She looked at him. How did you? Patrick and Ndlovu is not subtle, Edmund said. Also, your phone case has your old company's logo on the back. She looked down. It did. I knew from week 1, he said, who you probably were. I just wanted to see what you'd do with it. She stared at him. Due diligence, he said, and picked up his coffee. She called her father in late March from the truck, parked outside the hardware store, which had by now become something of a significant location in a story that would be hard to explain to most people. You knew, she said, that he was a good man? Yes, Kweku said, that he'd figure it out. Edmund Calloway has been building things his whole life. He knows the difference between a solid foundation and one that looks solid. A pause. I thought you might need to meet someone like that. You could have just introduced us. You would have done due diligence on the introduction and found reasons to opt out before you got anywhere. She sat with that for a moment. He has a son, she said. I know. I've met Marcus. He told me the capital of every province in under 4 minutes, unprompted. That tracks, she said. Her father was quiet for a moment. Are you happy, Daphne? She looked at the hardware store. Inside, through the window, she could see Edmund at the counter talking to someone, gesturing at something on a sheet paper, pointing and explaining. The same way he did everything. I think I'm getting there, she said. Good, Kweku said. That's all I needed to know. Marcus found out about the photograph on a Sunday in April. He found it in Daphne's coat pocket. The drawing, the one he'd made in February, when she'd asked him to get her phone from the inside pocket, and he'd pulled out the folded paper instead and looked at it and looked at her. You kept it, he said. I kept it. He held it very carefully, like it might dissolve, and looked at the 3 stick figures in front of the stick house. Then he folded it back up along the same creases she had used and handed it back. "You should keep it," he said. She put it back in her pocket. Edmund was watching from the doorway of the kitchen with his arms crossed and his expression doing the careful thing it did when something had affected him more than he wanted to show. She met his eyes over Marcus's head. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. Sometimes that's enough. The thing about second chances is that they don't look like what you expect. They don't arrive announced. They arrive as photographs on kitchen counters, or as strangers handing you a jar of pasta sauce in a grocery store, or as small boys who crash into your coffee cup and feel genuinely terrible about it and make sure you know. They arrive as towns that are cold and too quiet and surprisingly hard to leave. Daphne Osei had built her life on knowing when to walk into a room and take over. She was very good at it. It turned out the harder skill. The one nobody had asked her to develop, the one her father had maybe seen she needed, was knowing when to sit down, be still, and let someone else set the pace. Edmund Calloway was a man who built things to last. He wasn't interested in anything less. Neither, she discovered, was she.